So thanks very much, and we will move into the 8:45 session, workshop number 1, fiscal forecast. So thanks for joining us for the first workshop today, fiscal forecasts and challenging budgeting decisions in a new era. The Vermont Community Foundation is this session's sponsor. Unfortunately, the Vermont Community Foundation was not able to join us today in person, but we are extremely grateful for their support. The Vermont Community Foundation inspires giving and brings people and resources together to make a difference in Vermont. This includes helping to coordinate philanthropic response in times of crisis and challenge. The foundation is committed to helping Vermont communities that are impacted by COVID-19 by responding to immediate needs and long-term recovery efforts. Visit vtcovid19response.org to learn more. This session will take an updated look at the fiscal forecasts of the Vermont Education Fund. Legislative representatives will provide insight into their views on the current fiscal realities and goals moving forward. Finally, 2 local district teams will simulate difficult budget conversations for the upcoming fiscal year and provide reflection questions to consider moving forward. Mark Peralt, Senior Fiscal Analyst at the Joint Fiscal Office, will start us off with the most up-to-date fiscal forecasts of the Vermont Education Fund. Representative Janet Ansell, Chair of the House Committee of Ways and Means, and Senator Ann Cummings, Chair of the Senate Committee on Finance, will provide brief comments on the current fiscal realities following Mark's presentation. You will also hear from Representative Ansell and Senator Cummings at our next workshop with our legislative panel. So with that introduction, I believe I'd like to turn it over to Mark to get things started. And then if we just get Mark's audio working, we will be all set. Not yet. There we go. Oop. You're still muted, Mark.
There we go. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
That's okay. Okay. Can everybody hear me? That's good.
Yep.
Okay. So I am here this morning to present you with the most recent version of the Education Fund Outlook for FY21. And the information I'm being presented includes an FY20 closeout that was just finished on Monday morning. So this balance sheet is going to be a little bit different. When I get to it, I will post from my screen the most recent outlook, which is a little bit different than the one you may have received earlier this week. I thought that I would, because we're in new territory here and we're in an environment that's constantly evolving and changing, I thought I'd start by briefly recapping where we are now. Then we'll go to the FY21 Outlook, and I can walk you through there with the revised revenue forecast and the FY20 closeout. And then I'll talk a little bit about the options that the legislature has laid out in Act 122 for addressing the projected deficit in the education fund. And then finally, I may talk a little bit about FY22 and what we're looking at right there. I know you've got a lot on your plates dealing with just FY21, but I think it may be helpful just to think a little bit about what we'd be going into in the FY22 year, and we'll be working on that starting this fall. So how did we get here initially? Prior to the outbreak of the coronavirus back in March, the education fund was quite healthy. We had a full stabilization reserve of about $37 million, and we had actually had a surplus of about $12.9 million. Following the outbreak, projected revenues primarily from the consumption taxes, from primarily the sales and use tax, fell dramatically below the January consensus projections for both FY20 and FY21. Very significant non-property tax revenues into the education fund account for about 1/3 of the total monies we get in here. So it was a big change in a very short amount of time. The initial revenue estimates that we were working with also fluctuated very widely because we had much uncertainty about the depth and the duration of the economic slowdown. Epidemiological models that were being developed there wasn't a lot of track record at that point. So the revenue estimates, I think, initially were very conservative. Since March and April, when we were working at very significant numbers, the education fund has continually shown improvement, and I can talk a little bit about that when we look at the actual balance sheet. And there was also a significant amount of uncertainty around the deferral of the sales and use and the meals and rooms taxes to the state. Payments, they're trustee taxes, but the payments that the collectors of those taxes, their due dates, were put off, so that money came in later, and we weren't sure we were going to actually be able to collect all of it. So that led to a lot of uncertainty. That deferral amounted to about $53 million, so it was a lot of money to track. At this point, with FY20 closed, I can show you what the end result is, and it's much better than we were initially looking at. So now, normally, the education property tax rates are set high enough each year to support voter-approved education spending and to maintain a full 5% reserve in the education fund. However, doing so in FY21 would have resulted in property tax increases that the legislature deemed unacceptable. Basically, the way the education fund works is that once we've determined how much money we need for the year, subtract from that amount any amount of money that's available from non-property tax sources, which accounts for about a third of the total. The remainder then needs to be raised on the education property tax. So going through that normal process this year would have resulted in a double-digit penny increase in tax rates. And again, the legislature did not want to get on that path. I think the legislative intent this year was to do two things. It was to fully fund pre-K through 12 education in FY21, and two, to limit the education property tax increases that homeowners and businesses would face in the midst of an economic downturn. So in order to accomplish that, what the legislature did was the following. So tax rates for FY21 were based on voter-approved education spending in FY21. That spending was up about $74 million over 2020. Oops, nobody sees my screen. Anyway, okay. Can people? I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty here. Are people able to hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, and your screen just popped up as well too. So if you've got a document,
that was the issue. Okay, sorry about that. Anyways, in Act, just recapping here, in Act 122, which was originally H 959, the legislature set the FY21 tax rates based on one, voter-approved education spending in 21, which is up about $74 million. The January consensus revenue forecast for both 20 and 21, and the non-property tax revenues were down in those compared to the January forecast by $31 million in 20, and another another 31 million in 20 and another $75 million in FY21. So significant reductions in revenues. It assumed that the projected $12.9 million in a surplus that originally we expected to have in 2020 was used to reduce rates. And the legislature decided that they wanted to maintain a full stabilization reserve in FY21, which is about $38 million. So under this scenario, the average homestead and the non-homestead property tax rates increased by 3.2 cents for homestead and 3.4 cents for the non-homestead property tax rates, respectively. And that was significantly better than we had were looking at in worst case scenarios back in April. So with that, I think I'm going to try to pop up my screen. Wow. Apologize for this. I'm not a GoToWebinar user very often, and I am going to go ahead and try to bring up a document on my screen.
So
Chelsea, I need a little.
you're doing
I need
great so far. We can see your screen. So if you just pop it open, we should be all good.
So you're seeing me on my screen right now, and if I pop up, I'm not even sure how to
You
get
have
to
your
it.
document up on your screen, Mark.
We can
Okay.
currently see your motorcycle.
Okay, how's this? Can you
There it
see that?
is. Yep.
Okay. Thank you much. Okay, so up on here we see the education outlook that's been updated as of Monday with the closeout for FY20. I'm going to just take you down. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over this, but I want to show you what's going on here. So originally we had current year unallocated down on line 31 of about $12.9 million. You can see that money's been used up. But compared to a deficit we were looking at initially in 2020, we're now looking at a stabilization reserve at 4.5%, which is only about $4 million short of a full reserve. So we're actually coming out of FY 2020 in very good shape compared to what we thought we might have been at earlier. And that rolls forward into FY 21. And let's see if I can show you here. So tax rates back up here, resulting 3.2 cents increase in the average homestead tax rate and about 3.4 cents in the non-homestead property tax rate. So education funding, if you can look on line 10, that $1.7 billion, we've fully funded that in this scenario. We've done it with tax rates that only increased by the amount that taxpayers would have expected tax rates to increase based on voter approved spending and the January forecast. The problem with this is that the amount of money that comes in from the property tax grows by about $60.4 million from FY20 to FY21. However, it falls significantly short of the amount that's necessary to balance the education fund in FY21. So we get on to the bottom here, and you can see we're now projecting a $92 million deficit. There's a number of ways that the legislature intends to address that, which I'll get to in a minute. But one thing I'll point out on here initially is that this balance sheet, although it has FY20 closeout numbers in it, we do not yet have prior year reversions from FY20 that would be carried forward into FY21. Reversions generally average about $5 million a year. So this deficit is probably going to be something under $90 million by the time everything's said and done with this piece. So the situation we're in is pretty difficult going into this year, and there's a lot of work for the legislature to do when they come back in August in order to address this problem. But it's significantly better than I think we had as much as $170 million deficit back in March and April, when it was the actual hit on revenues was a little bit uncertain. So when the legislature comes back in August, in Act 122, the legislature laid out a number of ways that this $92 million deficit can be closed. So I'll just tick through these carefully. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one because you'll probably be hearing later today on some of this stuff from AOE. But here they go. So number one is the state received an allocation of about $31.1 million from the elementary and secondary school emergency fund. And of that total $31 million, about $28.8 million will be available in grants to school districts in FY21. The hope is that once these grants are awarded, they will be available to help reduce the FY21 deficit by reducing the education payment to school districts, which is up here on line 22. By reducing this amount and offsetting the amounts with ESSER money, we'd be able to reduce the deficit and still maintain school spending at the level that voters approved. One other thing to note before I go on to the next piece is that the ESSER money, unlike the coronavirus relief fund money, is quite flexible in its use. So it's not going to be as big a problem to use this money as it is to use the CRF money, I don't think. And I know that last week the Agency of Education sent in the application for this money to the Fed, so that's moving forward at this point. The second way that we may be able to address the deficit on that bottom line there is the use of the CRF funds. The state was allocated about $1.25 billion from that fund earlier this year. And in Act 122, $50 million of that money was appropriated for public and approved independent schools in FY21. The CRF monies included $12 million for the summer meals program, $6.5 million in a grant to the Efficiency Vermont for indoor air quality grants, $21 million for reimbursement for public school expenditures related to coronavirus, $1.5 million for approved independent schools for reimbursements, and then $1 million was available for accounting and technical assistance. Now, one issue with the CRF money is there's an explicit prohibition against using the CRF money to replace lost revenues. If that prohibition hadn't been in there, we could have simply offset the loss in the non-property tax monies in FY20 and FY21 with some of these funds and called it a day. But because these monies are very restricted in terms of their uses, it's a little bit more difficult for us to do that. I know that you've all been working with the Agency of Education at this point to try to identify both new costs and previously budgeted costs that may be eligible for some of this money through grants. One distinction to think about there is that the money that is provided to reimburse schools for costs that they had not previously budgeted for will not be available to help reduce the deficit. But any monies that were budgeted and are eligible for reimbursement for this money will help reduce that. And I talked to Brad James at the Agency of Education a day or so ago, and he thought that the split was running about 50-50. So roughly 50% of the money that goes to school reimbursements could probably be used to offset some of this deficit. Now, when the legislature returns in August, they've also set aside another $100 million in CRF funds and for future use. Those funds will have the same issues around, only being used to offset eligible costs, but it's a sizable amount of money that's going to be available. So the last thing on the federal aid is that I read just this morning that there's a fourth federal aid package in the works. In the Senate version of it, they've proposed about $105 billion for schools. They provided some money for businesses. There's a number of provisions in it, but one that's absent, at least so far from the Senate version, is more money for state and local government, specifically money that could be used to offset lost revenues. So even though there's additional money coming that should help, again, there may be some issues with the flexibility and how we can use it. So stepping away from the federal aid for the moment, there are a couple of other things that the legislature identified that may be available for reducing the deficit. One is that the stabilization reserve under the outlook that you're currently looking at right here, if you go back down to line 27 here, you can see that there's a $38.2 million in the stabilization reserve, which is a full 5% reserve, which is required by statute. However, just like we have got through FY20 by dipping into that reserve, it would be possible to reduce some of the deficit if necessary by dipping into the stabilization reserve. That would help us get through FY21. The problem is that any reduction from that 5% reserve would need, under current law, would need to be made up in FY22. So in effect, you're pushing the problem out a year. But given the environment we're in, that may be a necessary option. Act 122 also identified several other backstop ways that the deficit could be reduced and schools could be fully funded for the year. One is that they considered possibility of adding some additional revenues. Another option would be to reduce education spending, although at this point that's likely to be an FY22 consideration. The third would be borrowing from the general fund, inter-fund transfers. Also identified as any other borrowing that would be allowed under current law that districts could do. And then finally, a possibility is simply making an appropriation from the general fund in order to make the education fund whole. Now, I've talked primarily about non-property tax revenues. It's also possible that people will have difficulty paying their property tax bills next year. It turns out in FY20, that doesn't appear to have been a problem. Whether it will be in FY22, we don't know, but there are provisions in the law that would allow municipalities to borrow for any shortfall. Municipalities, as you all know, are required to make the payments to school districts, regardless of whether they've actually collected the money. So there's a backstop in the law now for municipalities if they are unable to collect a significant amount of money that they're due on property taxes. They'd be able to borrow in order to do that. One of the considerations that you might want to be aware of is because the billing dates in some cases will have been pushed back because of delay in the income tax and some other things. There may be some cash flow issues for districts. In other words, some of the districts that you're used to receiving money from the municipality or the education fund on a specific date, because the collection dates in some municipalities may be moving, the date that the money is due to the school districts may also switch. The last thing I wanted to touch on is that we're coming out of FY20 in much better shape than we initially anticipated. Some of that may have been a result of the influx of all the federal money and state money that went out to businesses and individuals and unemployment insurance. It looks like we may have been able to keep people afloat for the year. FY21, it's a little more uncertain how that will happen. And then, by FY22, any shortfall that we're carrying forward in FY21 would need to be addressed. And under the current forecast, we're looking at another $40 million reduction in non-property tax money. So just to give you a sense of what's going on over the 3-year period, we had a $31 million decline in FY20, a projected $75 million decline in FY21, and then an additional $40 million decline in FY22. So it's close to $150 million shortfall in revenues over that 3-year period. So FY22 is going to be another difficult year, but I know you've got enough on your plates right now. That'll be something coming up later. So with that, I think I'm going to stop. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I'm not sure where we are here. Let me show my other.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. No, that was extremely informative. I think what we'd like to do at this point is see if we can bring in Representative Ansel and Senator Cummings just to provide some additional thoughts and comment on the fiscal situation. And then at that point, we might be able to open it up for questions either then or at the end of this workshop.
Okay.
Looks like Representative Ansel is unmuted, so feel free to provide some comment.
Okay, I can't, this is the first time I've used GoToMeeting, so if I'm a little clumsy here, please be understanding. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting us to participate. Listening to Mark sort of brings me back to those really uncertain kind of dark days, the end of March and early April. There were times when I think we were looking at a possible shortfall for fiscal 20 that was around, I can't remember, 40 million or something, and upwards of 200 million for fiscal 21. And I'll admit that there were times when I just thought to myself, I don't know really what path to take here or what to do. Fortunately, we started very slowly to get somewhat better news in terms of the non-property tax revenues. And so fairly quickly, our committee coalesced around two main goals. One was to protect property taxpayers from the effects of the pandemic, so that we would only be asking property taxpayers to cover an increase in education spending. That was the way I like to refer to it, was sort of the way the world was on March 13th when we went home. And the other thing that we coalesced around was to be sure that we made that schools were going to have enough money to do the work that we were asking them to do. And I think we're only beginning to understand what the impacts are on kids of the closure of schools and the uncertainty about what happens in the fall. And I know that that's all work that all of you are very much engaged in. But it was not a time, I think, from perspective of any of us on the committee, to ask schools to tighten their belts and reduce spending. So in that context, I wanted to make one very small but significant correction to what Mark said. He did a great job going through the 7 items that we identified in the bill as ways that we might deal with the fiscal 21 problem. He mentioned spending reductions as one of them. We were very careful not to use that term, and instead we talked about cost reductions, so that this was not an attempt to tell schools that they had to spend less, but it was a recognition that in some cases schools would be able to spend less, and that we knew that they were going to do that if they were able to. So we did not want to set this up as a spending, as a decision by the legislature that schools should spend less, but we wanted to create an environment where if they did, that was money that we would be able to recapture. The other point I wanted to make, and Mark has done such a great job going through all this, I don't have much to add to his presentation. But the other thing I wanted to say was that one of the reasons, sort of framing the discussion that we had when we were in session and that we will have in August, is the decision that we made a couple of years ago to put 100% of the sales tax into the education fund and to no longer rely on the general fund. That in the beginning of the pandemic, that seemed like maybe that was a risky decision. I think in retrospect, it was a really solid one. Kept us out of debates about general fund versus education fund, which have always hampered discussions in the past. And because of the Wayfair decision, which allowed us to collect sales tax on internet sales, actually the sales tax, although it's a consumption tax and certainly suffered in the pandemic, it's doing better than we might have expected because people continue to buy things. Mark made the point that the federal money, it goes out to individuals, and so there's money in the economy. People continue to consume goods. They aren't going to restaurants so much, but that's a smaller part of the education fund. And because the sales tax on those internet sales now comes to Vermont, the loss in the sales tax revenue is more manageable than it might have been otherwise. And so, that's just a point that I think it certainly was of some reassurance to me as we were working through this. When we come back in August, we have a huge challenge in front of us, no question about it. The education fund can carry a deficit. That's not ideal, but it's an option, and it's one of the options that's identified in that list of seven strategies. So I'm very interested in hearing your discussion, which will help inform the work that we do in August. And we'll stay in this here in case there are questions that I can help answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Ansell. And Senator Cummings, we would like to give you an opportunity as well. Let me See, you're muted at the moment. There we go. Maybe.
Unmute myself. Okay. So I'm new at this. I'm getting to be pretty proficient at Zoom, but webinar is a new one. I think one of the advantages that the Senate Finance Committee has is that tax bills have to start in the House. So we have the kind of luxury of letting the House do a lot of the initial tax work, and then we can build off of it. You know, while Janet was dealing almost exclusively with the property tax, we were also dealing with small things like broadband and extensions, and this pandemic showed us how important access to broadband is for students. So we went through essentially the same process and decide, you know, what we were dealing with were huge unknowns, and it's in hindsight a good idea that we didn't make any major decisions. We decided we would not send all the budgets back, tell schools to revote your budgets, cut your spending, because we didn't know what this brave new world of remote learning was going to cost schools. We didn't know. The projections were dire. I think, you know, the projection we had was, well, it'd be a 15-cent tax increase to cover the originally projected deficit. It went up and down, but as the revenue actual revenue numbers came in, things have obviously gotten better. We're only looking at 92 million. We're working, you know, we're working our way back to coming in August, and now we will have a better idea. You'll have a better idea how much it cost you, how much it's going to cost you, which is the other thing we don't know. When schools reopen, we don't know what it's going to cost you and how you're going to set things up. So I think that, and I am getting a screen that says disconnected from audio, so I have no idea what's going on.
Yep, you're still with us.
I am still with you. Okay, it says I'm talking, but that's not abnormal. So anyway, we will be back. The really hard decisions will come in August. We will start to get a better idea of the ability of people to pay property taxes. When this all hit, some towns had a final payment. It looks like that money came in, but next year will probably be the more telling time as people start to figure out whether or not they have jobs, whether or not their businesses are open. There's still a whole lot of unknowns, and the biggest unknown is what's the virus going to do. If it keeps going the way it's going, and you know, we're doing very well by any national trend, we'll probably be all right. If it, you know, we have a resurgence and things get shut back down again, things will be a little, you know, will be more difficult. So I think what we're learning is how well we can adjust quickly and how well we can learn to deal with the unknown, which for people that deal with numbers, that can be a challenge. Numbers generally are finite. So I think that's where we are.